Hello, ladies and gentlethems. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. My common name is Nick Dalton, and I'm honored to come to you from the Hanna Institute team. And if you're watching this video, it means that you've signed up for this Summit at Home series throughout 2021. And what that means is that we're going to build off the relationships and the conversations we had at last year's 3-day summit to provide a series of videos to really help our school communities, whether you're a teacher, an administrator, a parent, or a student, navigate not only digital learning, but also how we want to change the way we gather when we come back in person, whenever that may be. Now you can stay in your pajamas. I have to get out of mine and have a little more caffeine, and I'll see you in just a second. Let's cover the 3 different sections of what will be explored in the next 20 minutes. Number 1, we will disrupt what we call the mentalist model and offer suggestions on how we can enter a trauma-informed care model instead. The second is dissecting the difference between trauma and psychological trauma. The third is increasing our awareness regarding the connection between stress, trauma, and relationships. Let's begin with the mentalist model. This photo is the clearest depiction of a mentalist model we could provide, especially given what's happened in the last 4 years in Northern California. Now, what a mentalist model doesn't do is it doesn't allow for the ability to adapt to the current needs. A mentalist model or system often applies simplistic solutions to complex adaptive problems. In this photo, what you see in the foreground are bumpers that are meant for a road and not a train track. So when that trauma train comes tooting along, toot toot, it'll run over the hose and possibly even go over to the firefighters and take them out, which is a metaphor for what trauma does. It takes us away from our resources. Instead, in a trauma-informed or trauma-responsive model, we need to allow for trauma on the front side so it doesn't take time on the back side. And that is where we find ourselves currently after a year of shelter in place and with COVID, as we are all swimming in cortisol, which is a great chemical and helps us adapt and survive, but when going unchecked, actually causes damage on our body because it stays in our bloodstream 7 times longer than all those yummy Bob Marley chemicals like serotonin and oxytocin. And if you think about it, this is for those science teachers out there, the human body is about 80% water, 20% mass, which is the same as the earth, which is actually the same as cucumbers. So, all we are really is cucumbers with anxiety, which leads me to my first tip or trick, is we need to drink lots of water. Oftentimes we as frontline caregivers and even our students in class are far, far, far beyond dehydration. And the best way to flush cortisol out of our body is drinking water. If you want to kick it up a notch, Emeril Lagasse style, eat broccoli or cauliflower in the middle of your day because it'll hypermetabolize the cortisol in your bloodstream. Awesome science! Now, the mentalist model really has 4 different actions we use to keep people in relationship. These are going to sound very familiar to you. The 4 actions of the mentalist model are using restraint, coercion, seclusion, and isolation. Let's break down what that means. When we're talking about restraint, we mean reducing movement, reducing use of space, using authoritative rules that limit a person's ability to change posture that we did not co-create or were agreed on beforehand. When we talk about coercion, we mean forcing someone to do something that is not within their ability, not within their protected rights, or against that person's protection of their own safety. When we talk about seclusion, that means distancing someone from other human interaction, meaning they're unable to join and connect, but they might be nearby. Oftentimes this might be moving them to a different side of the class, or this might be moving them outside the door so they can still hear what's happening inside, but they are secluded from that space. The last domain, and perhaps the most vicious and damaging, is isolation. We define that as putting a person in physical isolation such that they have no other experiential contact with humans and human interactions. A great example is timeouts or locking someone out of or in something. So instead of timeouts, how can we time in? And a great way to time in is using trauma-informed care. So let's go to our friends at SAMHSA and their definition of what trauma-informed care is. They define trauma-informed care as care that is grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma, that emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, and that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. The way we engage in trauma-informed care is then to decrease the domains that we use from the mentalist model, which means we have to use less restraint, coercion, seclusion, and isolation. And to do that, we also have to have a common vocabulary around what we mean as trauma. There are different ways to look at and define trauma. The Greek root of the word trauma is wounds. So when we talk physical wounds, let's think of acute traumas as being a one-time event or experience, all the way to complex trauma, which is prolonged or multiple events over time. But we also have to add a different definition. And instead of looking trauma as a disorder, let's look at it as a reaction to a kind of wound. It's a reaction that has profound injurious events and situations later on in life in the real world, and indeed introduces us to a world in which people are routinely wounded. We want to normalize the idea of trauma and the emotions and experiences that come from our trauma. So using that definition, we know that trauma is always going to require time, attention, care, and self-reflection, which brings us to psychological trauma. Psychological trauma is an overwhelming demand placed on the physiological system that results in a profound felt sense of loss of control, vulnerability, immobilization, betrayal, and increased appraisal. Oftentimes, psychological trauma is what happens when we're triggered or re-triggered by something that doesn't have anything to do with the present moment, but reminds us of something in the past. Here in Northern California, this could be when the winds pick up, or when your neighbor's barbecue goes off and you smell smoke. All these things could trigger you into psychological trauma, which leaves your body feeling one of those 5 different ways. The last one being increased appraisal, which is really just hypervigilance and assessing danger around you in a fight-flight response, which brings us to the human brain. Obviously, this brain is not to scale, nor is it in good detail. But if you pretend that it's my head and you're looking at it from the back, what do you see in the right hemisphere of the brain? Odds are you're going to say arts, communication, people living their life, the things we hold dear as humans. In the left-hand side of the brain, what do you see? In contrast, you see a lot of things that start with the word L. I like to think of them as lists, logic, language, and maybe most importantly for a school setting, listening. This is where science gets really cool. In the decade of the brain, also the 1990s, holla, they put someone in an fMRI machine. And once they were in there, they came over to the loudspeaker and said, "Think of the scariest memory you have." And as the machine went ka-chunk, 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 they watched in real time as the blood was recruited out of her left hemisphere into her right hemisphere. And then out of the right hemisphere back down into that area where you see that beautiful garden. Which means that there was no blood in the entire rest of the brain to help you function. And the back right-hand side of the brain is the fear center. Now, in that fear center is where we stay in fight-flight response, which means we didn't have access to all those other parts of our brain. We couldn't listen, we couldn't speak, we weren't thinking logically, and we definitely couldn't access our lists. And this is where we talk about a stressed or traumatized brain is only going to focus on nonverbal communication, which is actually 60 to 90% of how we communicate. And here's the clincher, it's cultural. A child who comes from a traumatized environment is going to be not only misinterpreting what you're saying, but they're also going to misinterpret all your nonverbal communication because it's based on the past and on how they were brought up. In a school setting, this is key. We talk about those kids that can't hold space with 30 other children because they literally cannot hold the stress load. But we also talk about those kids who can't get the work done because they can't listen properly, or they can't write because they literally don't have access to the left-hand side of their brain. And this is where it gets tricky because we all navigate stress in different ways, and that's also based on culture. In this next moment, let's talk through how our heart rate is directly affected by stress, which varies depending on how we've been exposed culturally to stress throughout our life. You have 3 different heart rates: your resting heart rate when you wake up, your active heart rate, and your battle heart rate. Now, your active heart rate should be somewhere between 60 to 90 beats per minute. As that heart rate goes up, you actually lose the ability to be in the present moment and lose your survival skills. So as you enter about the 110, 120 range, you start to lose your fine motor skills. As you get into 140, you start losing your complex motor skills. Now, on the way there, that's usually when the blood gets re-recruited to the fear center of your brain, back there in that beautiful garden, as well as to your major muscle groups. So that's when your legs are going to get jittery. That's your heart rate going up. Or those kids, you may have that run when something goes wrong in the classroom because they're in fight-flight response. But as their heart rate goes up, you start to lose the ability to hear and see. You also get tunnel vision. Then you get into cognitive processing issues with the brain. That's really, really high, into 200 beats per minute. But as you can see, this is no bueno. And there's one way that we can actually bring it down and help us be in the present moment, and that's through breathing exercises. By getting into breathing exercises that really are helping the body readjust, we're tapping into something called the vagus nerve or the wandering nerve, which is one of the oldest nerves in our body, and it holds all our stress. But despite popular belief, what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. I've lived there twice. It will follow you home. But using breathing exercises that we call 3-6 breathing or complete breathing, which is an inhalation for 3 counts and then an exhalation for 6 counts, making sure your diaphragm hits the bottom of your pelvic floor and then shoots back up. You're triggering the body to release serotonin and oxytocin, which makes the vagus nerve go. So you can do breathing exercises in real time to bring your heart rate down. Here's going to be another tip. Do it when you're not fully hijacked and your heart rate's up. So practice breathing exercises with your students and by yourself when you're not being angry at a Sonoma 4-way stop, or not when the class blows up, but practicing those breathing exercises beforehand. Number 1, so you know what works best for you, but number 2, so you can really help regulate the day and the stressors. And those are things you can do whether you're in a digital learning format or whether you're in person. Fun fact, there's no such thing as good or bad stress. There's actually only stressors and your body's reaction to stress, and that's cultural, based on a continuum. So we start with positive stress. These are things that bring your heart rate up a little bit, and we actually need to survive and be healthy on a day-to-day basis. However, there's also tolerable stress, which is a little more severe, and is when your heart rate goes up even further, but it's buffered by healthy relationship, so it comes back down. But when we start getting into tolerable stress, this is where we need to talk about perhaps the most vulnerable kids you have in your classroom, in the sense that they may be used to an environment where the tolerable stress is normal, right? It may even go into toxic stress and the severity levels. So as you become used to those levels, that becomes your baseline. And your positive stress actually requires a more intense kind of stress, which is where you start to see kids in your classroom coming in and they jack things up so that they just feel normal, while for everyone else it feels like toxic stress. And when we get into toxic stress on a long-term basis, that's when we have health outcomes that are no bueno. That's when our muscles start breaking down. That's when our afternoon coffee doesn't really do much for us. That's when we need a weekend from our weekend or a vacation from our vacations. Because on the 3rd day of our vacation, we've taken the stressors away and our body breaks down because it actually needs to recharge. And that's where we talk about the wear and tear in our body, because we'll hit allostatic load. Right now we're in distance learning and everyone is stressed. And so we have to look really not on saying, hey, how stressed are you? Because that's subjective, but looking at something objective, which is always going to be your heart rate. Your heart rate doesn't lie. When talking about how psychological trauma also affects the way we learn in a classroom, I have to mention race-based trauma. For Black, Indigenous people of color, or BIPOC, those communities can often recount tales of actions, words, and events that have a deep impact on the way that they live, speak, and think. So racial trauma, or what is now called by our science community, race-based traumatic stress, we're referring to the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. Any individual that has experienced an emotionally painful, sudden, and uncontrollable racist encounter is at risk of suffering from a race-based traumatic stress injury. It isn't a disorder like PTSD, but it definitely is something that affects our health. There is magic to be had, though, because it decreases the more a person is able to define oneself by internal attributes and has a positive commitment to one's racial identity and cultural language. But that brings us to a second point, which is the concept of spirit murdering. Now, this is something that Patricia Williams introduced in 1987 and something that Bettina Love talks to probably the most succinctly. And so I'm just going to speak her words. Spirit murdering is the denial of inclusion, protection, safety, nurturance, and acceptance because of fixed yet fluid and moldable structures of racism. And she speaks about this in regards to our educational system. This kind of violence toward children of color is more visceral and seemingly less tragic than physical acts of murder. But what it does is it's a slow death, a death of the spirit, a death that is built on racism intended to reduce, humiliate, and destroy people of color. And so when we talk about trauma-informed care within a school setting, we have to look at it also through a lens of racism and race-based trauma. There are the very overt ways that it comes up, but there's also the ways that it manifests itself in our policies and procedures. As you can see from this graphic, there's a slew of options when we're talking about race-based trauma that takes place within our school systems on a day-to-day basis. We've looked at traumatic events and we've looked at trauma or wounds, how it manifests itself on the backside, but we also have to look at how it affects behavior issues in the classroom and the way that we learn, because it's really complicated. If you look at a list of behavior issues that come from trauma, these aren't going to be foreign to teachers who spend every day in the classroom. Struggling with self-regulation and lacking impulse control, the lack of ability to think through consequences before acting. All these things will seem like everyday occurrences for those 10 to 15% of students that you often come into conflict with in the classroom. But there's a tricky part of this where abuse and neglect manifest itself in the same symptoms, the same behavior issues across socioeconomic and racial lines. However, there's also another thing we need to mention, which is that PTSD has 17 symptoms. In children, only a quarter of the kids that have severe trauma actually qualify for PTSD. So what we also have to look at is ADHD. The rise of ADHD could also be a misdiagnosed PTSD. So when we're looking at the root causes within our schools, we also have to look deeper through a trauma assessment, which brings us to how we learn based on our traumatic past. It affects us in many different ways. We'll have problems thinking clearly, reasoning, or problem solving. It's really difficult to acquire new skills or take in new information. And probably the biggest one, sustaining attention. All this is affected by the trauma in our life, not only through physical abuse, but also through neglect, which we also see manifested more in boys than we do in girls based on what it does to our brain. Let's reframe PTSD for kids. There is a new clinical term called developmental trauma disorder. And this is an easier way to look at how trauma affects the learning abilities and the behavior issues in our kids in a school setting. Because instead of thinking them as wounded or wrong or bad, we have to see that it affects their developmental trajectory, which is why they may be behind developmentally. And so looking at the connection of those things, we can actually help create a safer classroom in regards to our most traumatized children. So the million-dollar question is, how do we want to return? When we come out of COVID and shelter in place, how do we want to set up our classrooms to better suit not only our students' needs and their families' needs, but also our needs as educators? And for that, I go back to Martin Luther King Jr. and his seminal book, Where Do We Go From Here? He said, "We must be hammers to shape our new society, rather than anvils molded by the old ways." And to quote Bruce Perry, one of the forefathers of trauma-informed care, children aren't resilient. They're malleable. You have to bend them back. with compassionate tap, 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 tap. But how do we do that? What does that look like in real time? And for that, I have to return to the brain slide. Now, in looking at this slide again, I have to add a little something special. Now, even though all the blood got re-recruited to the right hind side of the brain, there was one point above the left ear that could still be engaged, despite all the blood being recruited away. And doing 3 things, you then could bring the blood back through your entire skull almost instantaneously. These 3 things are this. Number 1 is movement. We know that we shouldn't sit longer than 24 minutes to learn properly. But what happens when we walk and move to learn? Then we know it goes into every lobe of our brain, into every cell of our body, because every nucleus holds that memory. So movement is one, also done through breathing. The second is symbology. So that's why journaling is so good, and visual art. How can we learn that way and engage in that way? And the third is vocal tone. We've been using music to teach since the dawn of time. It's why the ABCs is also Ba Ba Black Sheep, which is also Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So if you use music, movement, and symbology as a means of engaging, not only do we learn more, which science has proven, but we actually engage more on a human level and learn more about ourselves. I would love to keep sharing with y'all, but my time is done. So to wrap this up and really put my flag in the sand around arts integration, I wanted to end with this quote by Laguna Pueblo author Leslie Marmon Soko. And she said, "The only way to get change is not through the courts or, heaven forbid, the politicians, but through a change of human consciousness and through a change of heart. Only through the arts, music, poetry, dance, painting, writing, can we really reach each other." Once again, my common name is Nick Dalton, and I hope you have a blessed day. We'll see you soon.